Hey, Pastor Joel here from Elam City Church in Peterborough, Ontario. I've been tasked to talk about leadership and more specifically leading in an apostolic and prophetic setting. And what's funny about this topic for me is that personally, it's that leadership was always something that I actually tried to elude, even in my professional career. Because growing up in the church, I always knew that managing people is a lot more difficult, and let's face it, a lot more time consuming than managing tasks and finding solutions. Lucky for all of us spiritual leaders, though, is that people are our task. It is actually what we as apostolics are called to do. So we need to have real God-given strategy, vision, and inspiration to lead people apostolically, especially in a time like now. So I'm going to break this session down to 3 talking points. First, I want to talk about how Jesus led and how we can aspire to the same kind of influence that he had on earth. And then I also want to talk about 2 disciplines that can get us there. And they're actually from a spiritual leadership book called Practicing Greatness, and it's by Reggie McNeil. And these 2 disciplines are the discipline of self-awareness and the discipline of aloneness, both of which we can adopt to become effective apostolic leaders. So let's get right into it. First, how did Jesus lead? Well, as we know, Jesus was and always will be the example we should follow. He led perfectly, even though he used people that we wouldn't normally call the A-team of any organization. They were not ideal candidates, but he effectively led a group of 12 inexperienced and unlikely disciples to carry on his vision and his mission. And he was so successful with it that here we are several thousand years later discussing it over Zoom. So why was it so effective? It was effective because of the divine revelation Jesus gave us that we as leaders are called to serve rather than to be served. Jesus' leadership was centered on blessing and serving others. In the world today, people look for good leadership because it leads to success. It makes people more effective, it makes people more efficient. Things get done under good leadership. In a similar but elevated way, Christ-centered leadership raises the level of blessing that can be released from us. So if this is true, and we know it is, we probably need to understand what serving actually is. When I say the word serving, you're probably thinking about acts of helping, counseling, and supporting, but this is actually a very narrow definition of serving. Whenever we define something spiritual like serving by a list of actions, we're actually restricting its expression. Instead, we need to think of servanthood as an attitude, as part of our Christian and unique apostolic characteristic. Service should always be carried out with the intention of bringing change to the recipient. Jesus served the rich young ruler by challenging his value system. Jesus served the woman at the well by making her evaluate her unhealthy relationships. Jesus even served the Pharisees when he chased them out of the temple. Every time Jesus served someone, it allowed them to evaluate themselves and have the freedom to either make changes or continue on in the same pattern. Christ-centered leadership blesses people because serving inspires and encourages people to become more than what they are, and usually actually a lot more than what they thought they could be. Why is that? Because Christ-centered leadership helps people become part of something bigger than themselves. And I think that if you're looking for a key indicator of a leader who has these characteristics, it's that the people who are being led are better. They are different. They are blessed because they are actually closer to Christ than they were before a servant leader entered their lives. Another key indicator of a leader who models Christ-centered leadership is their ability to influence. And I think this is particularly a hard one for us in Western cultures because we equate influence with earthly metrics. How many people follow them on social? How much influence do they have politically? What kind of power and position do they have? And I think, we as church leaders can sometimes also be tempted by these trappings of influence as well. But the truth is that ambitions for influence that we see, in business and politics are not at all equivalent to the influence that Christ wants us to display. In Mark chapter 9, Jesus called his disciples together because they were arguing about who was the greatest among them. And Jesus told them, look, if anyone wants to be first, he must be the very last and the servant of all. We're a movement driven by the guidance of the Holy Spirit in a lot of the decisions that we make, and it's a wonderful partnership that we have. The caveat to that, though, is that we also have to have strong discernment to be able to know what is God-given direction and what might just be ambition. Scripture also says that the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Jesus' idea of influence is characterized by humility and service. And leaders who have a healthy view of themselves are characterized by this humility, which actually gives them the capacity to serve even better. I believe if we can practice a level of self-awareness in the area of humility and service, we can also be Christ-centered leaders. So what does it actually mean to be self-aware? Awareness is often paired with words like knowledge, mindfulness, and consciousness. And when you add the word self in front of these words, you get a good idea of what self-awareness actually is. Self-knowledge, knowing who you are. Self-mindfulness, understanding, what your motives are in what you do. And self-consciousness, understanding how you're perceived by others. So as a leader, self-awareness can be summed up by your intentional desire and motivation to understand yourself. But why is this important? It's important because leaders who lack self-awareness are usually their own worst enemy. They can be sidelined by their own impulses and their own emotions, and this does not only affect their leadership, but also their effectiveness, and also their ability to influence others and serve in humility. On the flip side, leaders who do have this insight about themselves, leaders who are self-aware, have gained their own best ally, themselves. Because self-awareness gives you a very personal insight into your purpose and insight on how your behavior will affect what God has called you to do. Being self-aware also gives you a healthy understanding of how to measure your own success as well. If you have a high level of self-awareness, you're very much acquainted with yourself and understand how the choices that you make are actually going to affect others. And when you think about that, even from an apostolic perspective, you also understand how revelation, vision, prophecy, and even teaching can impact the lives of others. Our self-awareness as leaders is not only for ourselves, but also to understand and appreciate the impact and influence we have on the people that we lead. We can't tell people either in a directive or prophetic way to do things that we can't do ourselves. The more self-aware we are, the more we have the capacity to honor those that we're leading. Our self-awareness has the capacity to inspire confidence, instill trust, and even provide comfort. Another key indicator of Christ-centered leadership is our ability to appreciate and foster solitude with Christ. Now, I'm sure every spiritual leader on the planet can talk about how lonely leadership can actually be. But to lead like Jesus is actually far more profound than just loneliness. It's actually a pursuit of aloneness with Christ. And there are a lot of biblical leaders, Moses, David, Paul, who purposely practiced aloneness with God. Even Jesus went to the Garden of Gethsemane alone to wrestle with the salvation of the world. Leaders who are effective in the spiritual world not only endure aloneness, but they actually also schedule it into their lives. Why would they do that? Because it actually builds a depth of growth in us that can even become something that we crave, because solitude with Christ restores the emotional and spiritual center that all leaders need for the barrage of challenges that they face. To make this really simple, a leader who can practice aloneness is actually a leader who is simply comfortable hanging out with God. Silence and solitude with Christ really is the chief spiritual discipline that drives your ability to lead, because the more you spend time with Him, the more you become comfortable with His presence. And the more you become comfortable with His presence, the more accustomed you become to hearing His voice. And the more accustomed you become to hearing His voice, the more you're going to be immune to any other voice or influence that's going to try to derail you. So why should we care about seeking solitude with Him? Because it's how we're also going to be spending eternity. And because we as believers live our lives through the lens of eternity, we have to remember that we are created by God to enjoy Him and His presence. So we have to create opportunities to be alone with God and to embrace silence and solitude. Because if we want to lead from the overflow of God, we have to develop a taste for the soul nourishment that only God can deliver to us when we practice aloneness with Him. Moses emerged from solitude to lead the Exodus. David returned from solitude to become king. Paul ended his solitude to begin his missionary journeys, and Jesus experienced the most profound aloneness on the cross for our salvation. Probably the greatest thing we can do as apostolic leaders is guide people into the presence of God. Because it is only there that true change and true soul transformation is going to occur. So we are in a very interesting time for spiritual leadership, not only because of the pandemic, but also because we have a generation that is not comfortable with any form of authority or accountability. But we have to look at that as an opportunity. Because in order to be an effective leader, we have to commit to a process of spiritual transformation into the image of Christ. Self-awareness enables us to discover the aspects of ourselves that are not Christ-like and change them by going in and going after His presence. Then and only then can we lead others into that process. If we believe that it is Christ who will build his church, then he has to be reflected in us and in our leadership. Jesus is the fivefold ministry personified. He is the apostle, prophet, evangelist, pastor, and teacher. And Christ in us compensates for any weakness in leadership. So even if people today are skeptical, Christ-centered authority and accountability is what the world is looking for right now. And the apostolic framework that we function out of as a church not only gives us a model of Christ-like governance, but also the ability to become great leaders who can truly serve and bless others. I want to lead like that, and I know you do too. God bless.